This is Critical Nonsense, our high lowbrow show about culture, science, and tech. This week, I ask Joey about abstraction.
Woo!
1, 2, 3, 4. This is what a Joey sounds like. And this is what an executive producer and mushaboom Jess Vander sounds like.
Hi, this is Jess.
Too many Feist references.
Yeah, I don't know. Woe is my ignorance.
Woe is my ignorance to female independent vocalists of the 90s and 2000s. Jess, our house is clean. But surprisingly, we have a little bit of math-connected content on the back of our numeracy conversation, which is interesting. So why don't you hit us with your question?
Wow. Yeah, welcome back. Coming at you with more math. Actually, it was inspired by our conversation about numeracy a few weeks ago that looking for a new book to read, I stumbled upon Eugenia Cheng's How to Bake Pie, an edible exploration of the mathematics of mathematics. And
Great title. Great title.
Yeah. And of course, felt personally targeted because I was like, either this is just like clickbaity for me and it's going to be terrible, or, and I have pleasantly found it is great and interesting. And I am finding myself eating up all of these math thoughts that otherwise would have been intimidating, because this book is basically using analogy to explain mathematical concepts. And I think the book is introduced with one core one about abstraction. And that is the idea where instead of having to have a thing be expressly tied to one thing in the real world, can you make a formula or a set of rules or logic that can apply some pattern that you've noticed to other things? I probably should have used like a real outtake from the book instead of my own interpretation, but here we are. And I found myself getting really excited to think about math because of this. And I think also this idea of abstraction is something that relates to our numeracy conversation, maybe even relates to things that we experience on a day-to-day. So I would love to pick your brain, Joey. What is your comfort level with abstraction?
I think I'm comfortable with abstraction, but my high-pitched voice, it shows my like trepidation in fully asserting that I'm comfortable with abstraction. I do find myself often turning to metaphor and analogy. I think naturally, like when we wrote the book about influence and sort of the nature of influence back in whenever, like 2015, 2016, just as increasingly like influencers and those ideas were sort of pervading and people were asking questions about it, I wound up using a lot of metaphor to sort of break down these concepts of influence into constituent parts to be able to understand it, right? Like connections to sort of like gravity wells as one type of thing, or algorithms or other ideas, which is, for me, it was a means of like simplifying and concretizing. Is that a word? Concretizing? Can I say that?
Sure. Let's make it a word.
Yeah. Sort of making solid, like very nebulous ideas like influence. Yeah. So that you could, I guess, generalize, like you were saying, and be able to think about influence in different terms. And so I think I'm comfortable with it, but I also, recognize that different people have different levels of comfort as when it comes to abstraction, but also I think maybe in different domains. Like I'm curious if you identify with this because I'm trying to like now read back to you, Jess, as like I feel like you are comfortable with abstraction in many domains, but you have also expressed that like abstraction within mathematics has historically been an arena in which you are not comfortable.
Yes, and I think something that was surprising to me as I was starting to read this book is that so much abstraction that we are comfortable with, we don't realize is an abstraction. So, like, the prime example used in the book is like, actually, before kids learn how to count, they're kind of just singing a song. And the song is 1, 2, 3, and you point at stuff while you sing it, and that's the way the song goes. And you haven't actually internalized that there's a relationship between objects and numbers. And there comes some point where you take this leap of abstraction where you're like, oh, no, no, no. I'm actually doing something while I'm pointing at these things. I am counting. Um, and then there comes, the next layer that most people end up getting to it in high school. If you're taking a high school math class, you get to this point where you're like, okay, instead of having to count specific things like tortillas or cows, what if you just substituted in like I could be adding anything. I could be adding X of A. Uh and the or like and then the number itself can be anything and suddenly you're dealing with algebra and formulas. And then if you're like me, you suddenly hit a wall when you're like, "Oh, calculus is so hard. Like now I have to abstract numbers into like this higher plane of visual that I can't actually imagine in the real world." But there are absolutely real applications of calculus, and sometimes we just don't learn about those things in school. But I think it was a revelation to me to think about how much comfort with abstraction that even I have in spaces or contexts that I didn't think that I had, because it's just so ingrained.
Yeah, you are very regularly like a phrase I feel like I hear you say a lot. Whether this is accurate, you tell me. But it's like it's kind of like
It's like this.
you are the queen of it's kind of like. You're like always looking for an
Yes.
abstraction, an analogy, a metaphor as a means of understanding or sharing understanding to like bring someone to the way in which you're seeing something, right? And like in so many ways, like an idiom is an abstraction, and we
Yes.
use those types of abstractions like quite regularly, right?
Yes, and I mean, ultimately, what's interesting is also seeing the way that this ties to our work in strategy, right? Like the idea that we are looking at patterns of things and trying to figure out if there are commonalities. Can you create structures around that? That's what logic in math is about, is like creating the if this, then this, because this. And we have very similar structures in strategy that are like that. Um, you know,
Yeah, I mean, you that point that you made about using abstraction as a means to be able to generalize, I think is an important one because I think in mathematics you use some set of rules, principles, right, patterns that people have established that they've been able to prove out in some capacity. Like these things work. You can use them in these contexts. For us, within sort of a more nebulous, less concrete arena of strategy where you're identifying patterns in the real world, in markets, in human behavior, whatever, you're trying to find a means to generalize
yeah.
with limited data. And so I think we turn to metaphor, analogy, abstraction as a means to say, this looks kind of like this other thing. Can I look at it and compare? And if the comparison holds, can I then generalize using this metaphor on like what would come next? Or if I introduce some new stimuli into a system and I was doing it to a system we know more about, this thing would happen. Would it happen in this current context that I'm sitting in? Could I replicate it, right? Like we are using it as a device to try and like create a bridge between a more known thing and a less known thing.
Totally. I One of the really fun parts of the book, fun. Uh that I thought it was really fun, is exactly this of like, let's just try applying this logic of one thing to other things. Like most people have probably heard of the idea of transitivity. If A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A is greater than C. And like the way that A, B, and C are related to each other. But it was really fun because it starts asking questions of like, let's try it with totally random stuff. Like if A is older than B and B is older than C, is A older than C? Yes. But if A is the mother of B and B is the mother of C, does that mean A is the mother of C? Like, no, it's the grandmother of C. If A is a friend of B and B is a friend of C, does that mean A is a friend of C? Like, no. But also, if A is the enemy of B and B is the enemy of C, is the enemy of the enemy my friend? It's a great question. Nah. I just think I just became so delightful to try to think about this nap as being something you could play with in totally random context.
Yeah, does the transitive property work in my current like drums with my friends? Like, yeah.
Exactly.
No. Yeah.
Also, I must say, before we go too long without acknowledging it, the tether of in the title math with a baking analogy is intentional because much throughout this book, every chapter starts with a recipe and how it's a metaphor for whatever subject that chapter is delving into. But there's a specific chapter that talks to in the realm of abstraction how like the way cookbooks are written are not usually very good at teaching you the properties of the thing that it's telling you how to make. It just tells you how to make that thing. And actually, if cookbooks were all like Start Here by Sola El Whaley, they would be written to teach you the things you need to be thinking about, or the samin, nosrat, salt, fat, acid, heat, so that then you know like, I can swap anything out that has the same property as this, and it should behave the same way. Like that is the math of food. And suddenly you got me. Now I'm here. I'm locked in.
Yeah. We watched Lessons in Chemistry, the show that is also based on a book that I don't know whom wrote it or anything about that, but I did watch the show.
Bonnie Garmis.
There you go. Bonnie, good work. It has like, it feels like it has that similar premise of like cooking is chemistry. Let me teach you about chemistry so that you can then generalize like sugars under these amounts of heats for these durations will create these effects. Yeah. Like how do you begin to generalize it? It is in my mind, it goes back, maybe the connection is not right, but like in conditioning, right? Like B.F. Skinner, like that type of early psychology training stuff from school, it was like conditioning generalizes, whereas punishment does not. Like a punishment will eliminate a specific behavior, but does not generalize, whereas operant conditioning will then generalize. Like if you hear a bell in a new context, then you may have that same reaction versus like if you get hit every time you hear a bell and so on and so forth. And but like that idea of like how do you like what are the important things to carry with you is like an interesting question.
Yes, and this idea that like we I think often assume that a thing that happens here can apply in other places, and it's actually paying attention to when it does or does not is the sign of somebody who's smart and or like craving that layer of like, does it actually? I don't know if it does. It depends. It might work. Like, is 2 plus what's the example that they give? Is 12 plus math. Come back to me while I think about this example that I'm trying to give. It's not working.
Well, it is like there is a cleanliness to the type of abstraction that math offers us, right? Of like 12 plus 12 is always 24, but are 12 eggs the same volume as 12 basketballs in the real world? Like 24 is not always
Right.
equivalent, right? Like
Yes, the
infinity is
example
infinity, but there are actually different sizes of infinity.
yes, and the example given too is like, okay, 10 plus 4 is 14, except for when 10 plus 4 is 2, when you're talking about time and a 12-hour clock. And so it's like, well, actually, if you think about it, it's like not always so. So,
Yeah.
bye.
Well, I think there are the people who enjoy mathematics for the predictability. Like you occasionally will hear like advanced mathematicians talk about it of like it is predictable and it is beautiful in its like if I learn these things and these things, 2 plus 2 is always 4 type of idea. I mean, obviously when you get into like way complex math, like all of a sudden
Yes.
like the edges start to fray a little bit, but there's like the beauty in this works in like a fully abstract realm as opposed to like in the real world, even with science, right? Like particularly in like medicine or nutrition, right? Like every single person's body is different. So the same conditions in two different bodies can have two
Yes.
wildly different impacts. And it's like, oh, like this doesn't work the same way.
Right. Exactly. There's like the beauty of being like, like the whole thing about math is actually the thing that you're going to argue about are the assumptions. This is something that Professor Chang talks about is like, if you all like, it's like, if these assumptions, then this conclusion. And logic guiding you between the assumptions and the conclusion means that like you can't dispute the conclusion itself. What you could dispute is whether the assumption was right in the first place. But like, if those things and we can all agree on those things, then otherwise it's like, well, here you go. And that feels like maybe some could call it an oversimplification, or you could call it like the Marie Kondo of the sciences. It's like, just ignore all this other stuff and like let's just focus on this particular beautiful thought. Cool,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Isn't that awesome? Yeah. I mean, I think I'm curious about like, so I had an experience recently. I mentioned to this to you briefly. There's this question of like where are your comfort domains of abstraction, or where is like a person with whom you're communicating? And I think often what great communicators get credited with is the ability to find shared ground quickly or effectively, right? It's the explain it to me like I'm a 5-year-old idea is like potentially one, right? Like great science communicators can remove
Yes.
I don't want to call it like jargon is the term, but it's I don't that is like such a heavy term that it's the technicality of it to just give you the meaning quickly. But I had this experience where I was using metaphor in a context that we're trying to like figure a thing out to pass it forward to sort of create a shared understanding. And it just immediately became clear that like people who I know are capable of abstractions in other domains in the particular arena that we were talking about were just like not
It's not
comfortable.
working.
And
Can't
it
get
was
there.
just like it went over like these 3 people's heads. And then I had a conversation 2 weeks later with one of them where they shared something to me and I was like, this is what I was talking about. And they went, oh, like,
Oh.
oh. And it like that question had stuck with me, but now that we're having this conversation, it's giving me like a new lens to think about that interaction of what is your like slang often carries like a ton of abstraction, but if you are not familiar or do not often use slang, like there are oftentimes I can interpret like slang from a culture that I'm not within quickly because I like it and I enjoy using it, whereas other people are like, I don't know what that means, and I'm like, isn't it obvious? Like this is where they're going with it, you know?
Yes, and to get to that higher level, to take that next leap, you really do have to have such a fundamental understanding of the thing, right? Like you really need to get it. And if someone is not able to make that leap, it's probably a sign that they have other confusion, which itself is valuable information, right? Especially if you're collaborating like we so often do. You need to understand the thing so that you can take it to the higher plane, so that you can say, actually, it's basically just this. I can simplify it by just saying this, and that means the same thing, and it becomes an abstraction that sufficiently generalizes the concept. So maybe if someone's looking at you like that's a crazy analogy, you have to talk it out a little bit more, because maybe
Yeah.
then they'll be like, wow, I didn't realize that I didn't get it until now. And now I'm with you on this higher plane.
There's also the issue of just like, where's your domains of excitement, or you come across an
Yeah.
idea that like even you don't belong in. Like the idea of like strange attractors is like this idea that I'm just like endlessly fascinated to or drawn to as
Right.
like an analogy because it works in many contexts, but is like such a obscure reference
Yes.
within like a field of mathematics that I don't understand outside of like conceptually, that like no one else gets it unless you're, it's like 1 in 10,000 people, or 1 in 5,000 people are like familiar with it. And I'm like, anyways, this reminds me of strange attractors. Allow me to give you the entire path of the analogy in
Yes.
order for you to get there with me.
Right, which most high level academics are like nerding out about a thing, but you really have to be so far, like you need to be running with them so far ahead in many, 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 many laps of that academic track to understand the thing that they're geeking about. And I think you're right.
Yeah.
It's like, well, if you have all of the base knowledge, then sure, let's use a sports reference and for a sports thing, because now everybody you're talking to is there with you and they can get that. That's a smaller leap than like, here's a thing that I have no no experience and comfort level in. Now you're gonna have to relate it to something I do know a lot about and cross those areas of interest for me to catch up.
Yeah, it's funny to think about like within a group or a community, like what is the what is the taxonomy of abstractions, right? Like metaphors, similes, analogies, like is there some taxonomy that exists both on like the types of abstractions that you could use, and then within what domains of like you have to build a language of abstraction in
Yes.
some manner within any community. Like we are forced to use abstraction to like navigate as like social creatures. But it's interesting to think about like which ones do different groups use as a means of sort of navigating life and the world and whatever shared goals they have.
Yeah. Wow. It always comes back to memes.
It always comes back to memes. Well, Jess, do you want to bring us to your abstraction corner?
Wow. This idea that baking is like math really opened my eyes to my comfort with abstraction and people's general comfort with abstraction being such a way that we navigate working together, understanding each other or not sometimes. And whether or not you read this book, I do encourage everybody to think about whether maybe they could learn another math thing or two, because I'm working on it and it's fulfilling. So thank you for indulging me in this math lit.
We'll put the book in our book list on the website. thisisnonsense.com, but we'll also put in the show notes. And then I'll share a video I shared with you, Jess, that's using a metaphor of a map and geography to explain different regions of mathematics and building bridges between like islands and a sea, which is also using abstraction differently to explain like connections in the domains of mathematics. And,
Wow.
Wow.
Look at us go.
Wow. We're building bridges. Critical Nonsense is a Sylvain production.
Brought to you by If This, Then That.
As always, we'd like to thank our executive producer and IFTTT, Jess Vander.
Wow, you're welcome. We'd also like to thank sound engineer and the proof, Alex Contel.
We would like to thank our programming coordinator and infinite well of gravity, Les Jacobs.
And thank you to our production crew and QED, Sarah Gilbert, Nora Mestrich, Chrissy Jensen, and Amy Water.
As always, thanks, Ellen. Special thanks to Maths. Oh, did you ever see the series Look Around You?
No.
It was like a satirical comedic show. It played on like Adult Swim, but it was playing off of the, I think, like educational videos that were made maybe everywhere, but like it was playing off of the British ones. And so they would just have like topics, and like one would be like maths, and like the episode would just do these weird things. But like at one point they were like germs, and then like it would cut into this educational video, and they're like, germs are from Germany, and like just like absurd, like it was all within this like pastiche of
conceit. Yeah,
the conceit of like an educational video, but it was wrong or weird or like really like subtle humor, and it was great. Look around.
That reminds me of the fake pronunciation guides, which I still think is like kind of an evil trick on YouTube, where there are standard ones that pronounce the words, and then I've mentioned this before, right? There's like the ones that so egregiously botch the word, where it's like Chipotle is pronounced Shantoodle, and thus I call the popular fast casual burrito chain Shantoodle.
Chameleon.
Yeah,
Chameleon.
Exactly. Chameleon.
I like actually know people who had never, like multiple people who had never heard the word chameleon. And to be fair, like one of them is like my brother-in-law, who like when he was young, his first language wasn't English, like the home language wasn't English, and so like he'd never heard it, he'd only read it, and he's like, I didn't realize it until I was like 12 and I said it out loud or something like that. He was like, it's not chameleon. Like what? All right, well, we did it. Thanks to Look Around You, thanks to fake pronunciation videos, and thanks to 1 + 1 = 2, or does it?
Depends.
I'm gonna go with it does. Just yeah.
Cool.
I need that today.
Probably.
I need that today.
Let's just say yes. Great. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, bye.
Okay, bye.